So where we left off yesterday was kind of this point in the slide. We're talking about, we're going to get into talking a little about back navigation. In particular, I asked you to read this article, Principles of Navigation, over last night to kind of get you sped up with what's there. One of the things to mention here, and they kind of mentioned at the top, is this is kind of a presuming that you're using the navigation component, which is a new way, a relatively new thing that Android's introduced, and it's all about kind of defining the navigation in your app through XML, but it also means that you're using fragments. It kind of underlying uses fragments to do the navigation and not activities. So because we're not using that, we're not going to get the behavior that it says out of the box. Okay, so we don't have that out of the box behavior because we're not using that navigation graph structure. Okay, so what it mentions kind of at the top, there's a little note here. Even if you aren't using navigation component in your project, which is our case, and actually a lot of projects still in the thing out there, your app should still follow these design guidelines, which means we've got a little bit of extra code that we need to add in order to support the intended behavior. Does that make sense for everybody? So the big section to draw you to is the section kind of towards the end that talks about, deep linking should simulate manual navigation. Okay, so let me zoom into this a little bit. There it goes. So the idea is that in typical fact, let's say I'm just normally navigating through our app. So here they've got, they start the home screen, they open up this garden application, it goes to the home screen of the app where the list of plants, etc. You go to a specific plant, you're on the plant detail screen, and so if you were to look at the Backstack there, you would kind of see the home screen, the launcher of the Android device, and then the list, and then the detail screen, right? So if you navigate back, that all kind of makes sense, right? The problem is when we're doing a deep link, we're jumping straight down to the details screen and bypassing everything before that. In fact, when I follow that deep link, it's going to replace all of the activities that are currently there to get us a Backstack that just only has one thing in it. All it's going to have is the detail screen, right? So we're bypassing all those screens, so that means our Backstack isn't really set up the way we want it to, but we prefer to have it set up the same way as if you manually went there. Does that make sense? So for us, we're thinking about the kind of pathway that you can get there. Normally the pathway that you get there is you start at login, you go to home, and then you go to, say, movie details. So if I don't do anything, it's going to just leave the application when I hit back and go back to wherever you were. So what Android's kind of asking us to do is to rewire it so that if I have a direct link that leads me down here, then it should take me back to home. Same story if I'm linking directly down to that user profile activity. That user profile activity is accessed from home. So both of those, if I deep link to either one of those, I need to back up into home. Does that make sense? Because that's how the user gets to both viewing a user or viewing the details of a game or a movie. Cool? Okay. So that historically has been a little bit of a gotcha, right? How do I recreate, how do I change what that Backstack is? That's been a hard thing to do historically. What happened though a few years ago, and this is kind of preceding this whole nav graph thing, is Android introduced a class called the task. I think it's, let me go back to my notes so I have the right name. They introduced a class called the Task Stack Builder. Okay, and what it allows you to do is it allows you to effectively replace the backstack was something else, right? Change the backstack to be whatever you need it to be for whatever context you need it to be in. This was actually originally introduced for notifications because this was a frequent problem with notifications where you'd click on notification and it would pull you into wherever that notification was for in the app, similar to how these backlinks work, but then you would navigate back and you'd go to the wrong place, right? Or you'd have, okay, I clicked on notification and now I have details and then details, and so if I hit back, I go back to the details screen that I was on previously rather than, going back to the home. So this originally was introduced for notifications, and if you look online, that's what most of the tutorials will be talking about, is working with notifications. It's a little bit different than the context we're working in, but this class can still do what we need. Okay? Everybody clear with that? Okay, so fast backstack builder. One way we can use this is we can say when we're handling web links, let's rebuild, kind of re-engineer the stack to be what I want it to be. So I created a backstack builder first by calling create on it on the class. That gives me a brand new builder. From that builder, I can start adding in things that I want to be in the backstack. So I start kind of from the beginning of the app and work my way down to where we're at. So I say, okay, well, you should have started at login. So we'll put that in first. We'll create a new intent to kind of replicate what that intent would be. We'll replicate then, okay, you went to home, so we'll add that in. And from there, you should have come down to the detail screen. So I'll add another item there, another intent. So that'll point to movie details with the extra of the movie ID that we kind of parsed from the path. So if I rebuild that stack and then call start activities, what it will do is basically leave the activity that we're on, create it, destroy it, and in fact destroy any activities that are currently there, and just go over to a new copy of movie details with the correct backstack. Okay, so that works, right? I can drop that into mine, and I can show you here how it's going to operate. Does that kind of make sense, right? So I can effectively rebuild it and then tell it to go there. Okay, so I'm going to pull up the movie list project and we can just see how that operates. So I'm going to bring this in. So this is something that we kind of need to do towards the end of handling the web link. And notice I'm only doing this in the case where we have that web link. And another thing that's worth mentioning, if I'm going to go ahead and go to the activity or reload the activity, there's no point in me calling model fetch movie at this point because we're going to immediately leave it. So any data it would catch, we kind of would lose. Make sense? So if I was going to do it this way, I would just plop this code in. I wouldn't load the movie. I would just go on and kind of reopen or restart the activity effectively with the right data, with the right backstack. So let's take a look at what this does. Okay, looks like I need to log in. Looks like I'm logged out. And as usual, I might have to wipe the data again. Oh, there it goes. It was just taking its time. So, get logged in. Okay, I'm having some internet issues. Well, let's see if I can bypass that for the moment. So I'm going to get out of here if I can. I'm going to just have to wipe the data and restart this device, as happens every day of late. So, wipe the data, restart it. And it's going to take a minute or two to boot back up. Okay, now I've got the app back up, right, and running. So what I can do is I can follow the link. So I'm going to do, I could either do this through the terminal as we talked about yesterday. I'm just going to go back to the Google search bar here, copy in my URL, so paste, boop. And so I'm going to go HPS, my movie list, movie matrix. I'm going to hit enter on that. It's going to give me this option. And pay close attention to what happens when I follow this link, right? Because you're going to see something interesting happen when I follow the link. So I hit just once. It's going to open it up. Now that didn't quite happen the way I wanted it to. Let me try that again. Maybe that it was already there. There it goes. So you might have seen a quick flicker, right, as I switched into it. Let me do that again. One more time. Try a different movie. Paste, Matrix 2. Just once. So it kind of goes there, and it has to then reload the other image, the other activity. So sometimes you're going to see that as a flicker, right? Because it has to destroy the thing that it's in and then kind of return to it and recreate it, right? Those are things you could work around. And if you're using fragments, there are definitely some other things you could do here instead where that may be less of an issue. But since we're actually using activities to spin this up, as each of the home activity and login activity, etc., are different activities, there is maybe this isn't the most ideal approach, but it does work, right? Just the only problem is you have a little bit of flicker sometimes when it's recreating things. Cool. So the other way you can handle this, rather than putting the code into this handle web link function, another way that I can handle this to build the backstack out is I could say, well, let's not handle it when you go or follow the web link. Let's handle it at the point where you press back from this screen, right? Because at that point, I can do it with less flicker. Does that make sense to everybody? So rather than doing it immediately when you come here, I'll do it when you leave here. Okay. So previously, one of the things we talked about is that I can override the on back pressed function. I did that in the home activity to just prevent the back pressing behavior. But the reason that we're allowed to override that is there's some cases like this where you may want to change what the default behavior is, right? So in this case, I might say, well, maybe if you're going back from this web link, we should just do something different, right? So normally what happens is that it just finishes the activity and it goes back to where it was there. So what I might do is override this. I can say, hey, let's check the action. If the action is not null, then you got here somehow through some implicit intent, right? Because we kind of know implicit intents have an action and explicit intents do not, right? And so if I'm navigating through my app, those are all going to be explicit intents. The ways I get here would be like a view or some sort of share system or things like that. If I'm having an implicit intent, I'm probably coming from another app. So let's just assume that. Let's just assume this is implicit intent means that we're coming from another app. I could be more specific on this. I could check that the action is specifically view and say only handle that. There's a bunch of ways you could write that if statement, but for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to check is it null or not null. Okay? So in the case where we are navigating through a web link, well, rather than you doing our usual process, rather than calling super on back pressed, just the normal behavior, I just say, hey, let's do our own thing, right? So let's create a Backstack Builder. The place I should be going back to is home. So I'll just build a backstack with login activity home and then start that. So that will effectively take me back to the home activity with the proper backstack. If I have just done something like start the activity with home, right? Say start activity with new intent home, that wouldn't have given me the right backstack. That would have meant, okay, details, now you're also, it's details, and then next thing on that stack would be home. So if I leave home, then I come back to the details, right? Which is not what I want. So does that kind of make sense as a different workaround? That's what I would prefer you do. That's what I would prefer you do, is override on back pressed instead of putting the code into when you handle the web link. That way you don't get that flicker. Cool? So pretty simple trick, pretty simple change. It's just about where you put it. Now notice if I did it in handle web link, I needed to add to that backstack, I needed to add the detail screen itself. But if I'm handling it here, we're leaving the detail screen so I don't put the detail screen on the backstack. Cool? So that's one way we can work around this issue. Obviously there's other ways. If we were dealing with fragments instead of activities, then I would probably override the on back press to just have whatever behavior I needed it to swap in the appropriate fragment. Cool? Questions? Does that much make sense? What I'm doing here in terms of working with the backstack, handling that on back press event? Okay. So that's one part of what we need to do. That's another, so what we've done overall, right? We've implemented the share, so you can share a link out. We've implemented these deep links using intent filters to kind of bring you back. And now we just look at, well, how do we handle if you leave the activity, right? How do you do the on back press? Another question to ask is, you'll notice when I open those links, currently it's always asking me, do you want to open that link in the browser or do you want to open that link in my app, right? Because both are supported, right? The browser can handle any action view links, but we're also saying, hey, we can handle some action view links. Maybe not all of them, but some of them. Cool? So sometimes you may want to provide a way that those links go directly to your app. And in fact, most professional apps, this is really an important thing to add in, is to make sure that they go directly to you and just don't ask the user about the browser, which makes things a lot more slick. So that means if I set this process up right, then say they click on my link from Twitter, it will just automatically pull them into my app and not ask, do you want to open that in the browser? Okay. So there's an article here about how to set that up, which you can take a look at if you're curious. We're kind of limited on time, so I don't want to get too deep into it. The long story short, in order to set those up, you have to have a website first and foremost. Namely, that website has to be there to kind of make the web links work, right? So these HTTP links actually need to work in the browser, first of all. So you need to have a web version of whatever your app is. Once you've done that, you can then upload some files to the particular parts on your domain, and basically Google is able to go look at those files, download them from the internet, and determine, oh yeah, you own this domain, right? So it kind of creates a bind between, or a link between your website and your application to prove that you own that domain and own that website. Cool? So in order to do the verification process, you do have to have a web version, right? One of the things that kind of inherently means, and we've kind of already seen this because we want to use these HTTPS links instead of, say, making a custom profile, means that if you're building a mobile app, large in part you need to make a web version of it as well. It's really hard to get away from, this stuff really is like, hey, you need a web app and a mobile app. It's not one or the other for a lot of cases. So things you could do if you, say, want to maybe have a domain that you can have as your own. One way you could go down there is go buy a domain and do all the setup and set up the website. Another thing you might do is just say, hey, maybe I can go get a domain name from, say, Heroku, right? So if I, for instance, spin up a Heroku domain, a Heroku app, then that comes with sort of a subdomain that I could use as my own as the domain in my app, which would be probably the ideal thing to do. Another thing to quickly mention here, Firebase does provide a way to host websites on their service as well. So you could actually host your website here, which is what a lot of people do, is you go ahead and host your website on their hosting service. If I hit get started, we can kind of see what that's going to look like. You start to see that they kind of give you some instructions to create it and can install. So you're going to see there's maybe a little bit of JavaScript and stuff right there. So I won't go through that because we're limited on time. But that would be the process that you would go through should you want to verify it and make those links fully work. So I'm not asking you to spin up a full website for this project. Cool, but this is one of those places where third and fourth semester really connect, because you end up building both the web version and that one if you're going to take this further. Okay. So you would take your skills, build it with JavaScript, build it with Express, host it up there, and then all those things would function. Okay. Another thing that commonly comes up is you might want to share images, right? So far, all we've shared is text, but sometimes you may want to share images with other apps or with your friends. Okay. Images are considered binary content, so we kind of follow a little bit of a different process, namely in the fact that anytime we're sending binary content, which is basically a file, or in this case an image, what we need to do is set up things a little bit different when we initiate the share. So previously I'd set the type as text plain. If I'm sharing an image, then it would be like image star or image JPEG, image PNG. If I know what particular type it is, image star just says, hey, I'm sharing an image here, but I don't know what type it is, right? So in this case, because we're pulling, if we're pulling things like, hey, I want to share the image, the main image for the movie or the main image for the game, I may or may not know what that file type is. I might be able to look at the URL and figure out from the end, okay, it ends with PNG, so let's send it as PNG. But if I send it as image star, largely the receiving side will end up figuring it out. I'm just telling the other side to figure it out. With that, the way we actually pass the image is under extra stream. Remember, text we passed into extra text. Extra stream would be where we pass the image. Now the image has to be provided as a URI. As it stands, in order for it to work with all the apps, it has to actually be a content URI. Another thing you can do in addition, you can actually pass both text and an image. The image takes precedence if you pass both. But say if I pass both of those and I go over to my messaging app, it will actually include both of those. Or if I go over to Discord, it will be both, here's the text and the image you share. So it is possible to actually share more than one piece, both images and text. If you just want an image, then you just do extra stream and no extra text. Okay. Also in here, because we're sharing a content URI, you also need to set the flag grant read URI permission so that it can read the file that you're sharing. Otherwise, depending on what device and what the version of that device is, it may not have permission to read it. So that's important as well. So it needs to be a content provider. It needs to be a content URI. In order for it to be a content URI, that does mean that it has to be local. Unfortunately, content URIs can't really be generated unless you have a local file. So I can't just take your URL, turn that into a URI, and have that work with most apps. I was able to do that, get that working with the Messages app, but when I tried that with Discord, it just says, hey, I can't find that image, so it didn't work with Discord. So that's one mention there. So we do have to have it locally to generate that. As far as local files, once you've already got it locally, once it's in the files that you're working with, whether you say the user's picked it from their gallery or taken it from a camera, then it's really just a matter of what we did with the camera stuff earlier in the week, where you just take file provider, ask for a URI, and spit that in. If you're pulling this from Firebase Cloud Storage, that means that we have to actually download the image from cloud storage, whether that be through using the storage ref or that be using the URL. We do have to download it locally and then use the URI, the file provider, to get a URI. If we're trying to share the images that go with the movies and the games, you remember where most of us, I think, have set those up as just, hey, these are URLs for some place on the internet. It's not in storage, right? So the user doesn't necessarily have that image locally downloaded on their device. It's possible that Picasso might have downloaded a copy of that, but it's really hard to guarantee that. So that inherently means if we want to share the game with the associated image, we need to download that image first, and then we can generate the URI using a file provider, and then finally we can actually share it. So there's a few things that have to happen in order to be able to share an image with your friends, more than text. Cool? Maybe a multi-step process. I'm not asking you to do this here. This gets a little bit involved, and again, time constraints. Just that's what the process would look like. Okay? So another thing that commonly comes up, oftentimes if you're sharing a link to social media, whether it be Twitter, Facebook, etc., Discord, you might have even seen in Discord, if I share, say, a link to IMDb, it gives a nice preview of that. Or anytime I share a Google Drive document, there's a nice preview of that document. Well, the way that often looks like this. So let's say we're talking about Twitter in specific. If I share a link on Twitter, it actually will turn it into this little card that's kind of attached to your tweet. So here they shared a YouTube video. You can kind of see the embedded player with, hey, it's coming from youtube.com, and the title and description of the video. So all of that kind of gets embedded into the tweet. So everybody see that? So that's a common need. That's a common need to have that work with different social media platforms. So Twitter, Facebook, etc. You often want to provide that. So let's talk about Twitter real quick, because the process is similar for all the different profiles, but all the different social media platforms, but they do it a little bit different. So this on Twitter, these are called Twitter cards. Twitter cards, you can attach things like photos, videos, media experience, etc. to your tweets. And oftentimes you're talking about attaching things that are on to your own website, or you might have somebody else sharing, as we're doing, maybe sharing a link to your website. So in order to do that, we need to add a little bit of markup that says to the web page. Well, hold up a second. Do we have a web page? So in order for these to work, again, you have to have a web version of it as well. So if I want those previews to work, I do have to have that details page provided as a website. I do have to have that as an online HTML file that can be downloaded. So, you're really in this place where we can't just build an app. We often have to build a website for that card to work. Summary card can be specifically the summary card, which is the simplest one. There's a few different kinds of cards. That one above was a player card. Can be used for a lot of kinds of websites, such as blog posts, news articles, products, restaurants, etc. So they're just designed to give the user kind of a preview of where they're going to be going to. So the way that we implement this with Twitter is Twitter asks you to add some additional meta tags to your page. So basically on the game details page or the movie details page, we would need to add some additional meta tags into the head. So meta tags that are required here, this is an example of kind of an image that's hosted on Twitter. You can see there's meta Twitter card that tells it what kind of card, so this case is a summary card. What site is it located at? So here they'll just use an anchor tag icon there, anchor or a username on Twitter, but usually that would be like your domain name you would put in your site. Title is kind of the title of that card. Description is what goes in that description, and then you've got an image. So all of those pieces are what actually generates what goes into that card. So out of the box, Twitter doesn't generate those cards. If you just host your website, don't do any of this metadata stuff, then it doesn't push it out. Is everybody with me there? So one stipulation that also means, remember, so this is metadata. Where does the metadata go in an HTML page? Well, it goes into the head. Okay. So this is relatively easy to add if you're writing the HTML files by yourself. It's also, what was I going to say? It's also important to mention that this does need to be different for every details page, right? So if I'm looking for the details of page of what, X or Y or Z, this does need to be different. One of the things we did in third semester, primarily we were working with React, okay? And most of our content was actually client-side generated, you might remember, right? Client-side generated, wasn't server generated. In order for this to work, it has to actually be able to get these meta tags without running any of our client-side JavaScript. Which does mean, as far as things go, in order to support these cards, you do have to do some sort of server-generated content generation, okay? Where those meta tags, that part of the page is generated on the server instead of being generated on the client. In fact, the main things that we talked about with the client side, we didn't really mess a lot with what was in the head, because you can, but there's kind of a limit to there. So there's just some additional stipulations that you need to be aware of if you're, say, building your website with React. Okay, so this is something that usually requires a little bit of additional work. Now, if you're building a website with, say, ASP.NET, with PHP, with Java, a lot of those technologies are inherently server generated already. They're already generating content on the server, so it's not necessarily a big deal. But historically, this has not been something we could do in React. So there's a few projects out there that can do server generation. One of the very popular ones is Next.js, I would just mention. Next.js allows you to run some code on the server and some code on the client, and it kind of makes it very easy to mix and match, which is awesome. So if you're going to support these Twitter cards, you would probably want to build your website with Next instead of React. The good news is transferring from React to Next is pretty easy. You can basically just take all your components, drop them over, and they'll basically work, and then add server-generated stuff as you need it. But the way that we had set it up with Create React App in third semester, we just had a static HTML file that served for every single page that you request. So if you tried it with that, the bug tracker that we built, it wouldn't work. Just a heads up. Okay. So there's some meta tags we have to add. And you can read more from Twitter about what all those work and some of the other options. Facebook also does this kind of the same thing. In order for these previews to work with Facebook, you also have to add additional meta tags to the page. Now notice the ones that I talked with Twitter all start with Twitter : like these meta tags only work with Twitter. Facebook got its own one: OG title, OG description, OG image. OG standing for Open Graph, which is kind of their technology that they use to manage pages and nodes and stuff on their system. So if you add an image, it's going to appear here, kind of on the post. The title would appear here, and the description you can see on the bottom. So that's kind of how that would be set up. Okay, so that's a big mention. You know, if you're going to try and get those link previews to work, you have to set up some meta tags on the website. That's how that happens. I think Discord also has some additional meta tags to make their preview work as well. Does that make sense to everybody? So that kind of answered that part of it, of how a preview works. Because as it stands, because we haven't built a website, should you try to go share that link, you're not going to see that preview, and that's why. Is because it needs to inspect those meta tags. Questions? So that kind of makes sense?
So you said the React serves that static page. I remember that static page. It was basically an empty index.
Yeah, it's just an empty index
Could we
skeleton.
not just throw meta tags in that thing?
Well, the problem is if you just throw meta tags in that thing, that is the same meta tags for the entire website, which really, when we want these cards, we want that to be specific
To that page.
to every page, right?
Okay.
So I want it to be like, here's the title and description of the movie you're sharing. Here's the title and description of the game you're sharing, or the user, etc. If I just put that into that skeleton, that's going to be for the entire website, one set of meta tags. So that does give you a preview, but it really doesn't give the preview that users generally want.
Okay. I
Right?
see.
So the same preview regardless of what link I share, which is kind of a problem. Cool. Any questions there? I wanted to just add that as an addendum because it's an obvious kind of tag along to what we're doing here, right? Okay, so that's kind of where I want to end it. We've covered just a few tidbits today, but we covered most of it yesterday. What I want you to do is on the game library, kind of move some dates around. What you should be working through today is phase 11, right? So I'm asking for a button or a menu item on the game details where you can share the game, and also on my profile where you can share your profile, right? And so the one from game details should lead back to game details when you click that link. The one from your profile, from my profile, should lead back to the user profile activity. Okay? So I'm going to hit start.